Okay. Welcome everyone to our first DEI dialogue for this year. It's exciting always every year. This is one of our most popular programs. And before we start, I'd like to thank the sponsors that make this possible. Mascoma Bank, Hypertherm Associates, New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, Revision Energy, Kennebunk Savings, Merchants Fleet, and our media partners, NHBR and NHPR. We welcome you all, and we're excited to take this journey with you this year. This challenge has developed over the years and the scope has changed. We started in 2020 with the Racial Equity Challenge, and we've continued to the DEI Workplace Innovation Challenge, which has a larger scope and encompasses much more than we started with. So this is the first dialogue. The intent of today's call is to preview how this challenge will work, any updates that we've done. We always focus on some DEI content in the dialogue, and today we're going to help attendees understand what accessibility is, why it's important, and what resources are available to them to make their practices more accessible. Then we are going to practice learning and finding innovative solutions with peers through dialogue, and we encourage all voices and everyone's best thinking. The DEI Workplace Innovation Challenge consists of 8 weeks of emails, as you must have been receiving, and if you haven't been receiving, you should reach out to me. First, check your spam folder. We do get some firewalls because of the constant contact emails, but each week you are going to get a main content email on Tuesday, and you will get a summary email on Friday. The change this year is that we use the same framework as last year, but the deeper dives are more detailed, and each week we focus on a marginalized group or a big issue in DEI. So you will notice that the deeper dive sections are getting longer, and we provide more resources there. We also did listening sessions after the last DEI challenge and asked our members what they're interested in and what they would like to see more of. And the response we get is, we want to know how to. The actual policies, practices, the things we need to start doing to improve or excel on our journey, because many of you have already taken some of this training and you want to know how to do better. So what we decided to do is to connect you to the various organizations that actually do this work. And so each week we're going to feature organizations that help businesses do this work, and we're going to have more practical advice this year. You should have received calendar invites for these dates. So you will have January 31st is today, February 15th, March 6th, and March 20th are dialogues. The dialogue actually takes place from 12 to 1, but these topics we know are very emotional, and to discuss them in depth, people need sometimes closure. You'll never get closure in an hour and a half, but we offer a safe space, open space for the last half hour. And it's just, if you want to stay along, ask questions to the experts that we brought, or discuss more with your peers, we have that half-hour space for you if you need it. Before we start, we always read the guidelines of how we show up. We ask that you speak from personal experience with I statements. We ask that you take responsibility for the quality of the whole group's experience. So share the airtime. If you know you're a speaker or someone who talks a lot, be conscious of others who need the space and time. Be brave in this space. We recognize that these topics sometimes are uncomfortable, but this again is a safe space for discussion. come from the orientation that we are all learning. Be curious, listen to gain greater clarity, and expect non-closure, as we said. We need to sit with our questions, even if we do provide the extra half hour. Some safety tips. We will be monitoring the chat window. There's 3 NHBSR staff on call, and many of our advisory group members are also on call. NHBSR staff members have that in their name. If you go and hover on our name, you can send us direct messages if you're noticing something that's uncomfortable, or you want to change your breakout room. You could leave the breakout room, come back into the main room. We'll assign you a different breakout room if you need it. So the flow of today's call, we covered the welcome and guidelines. Next, we're going to go into the DEI content and introduce our speakers. And then we are going to go into the DEI innovation exercise using a 1, 3, or 4 all approach. So you sit with the question by yourself for a couple of minutes to formulate your thoughts. Then we are going to put you in breakout rooms, and you can discuss that with the group. Then you come back to the plenary or the main room to share your learnings. And then we go into the what's next and offer the safe space as well. Okay, so today's speaker is Jules Good. Pronouns they, them, and Jules is a queer, multiply disabled accessibility consultant, disability policy professional, and always aspiring disability justice practitioner. They are the founder and consulting lead at Neighborhood Access, which has worked with organizations across the country to make spaces and practices more accessible to the disabled community. They are also program coordinator at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, a grassroots policy and advocacy nonprofit run by and for autistic people. We will share the extensive bio. Jules is one of our facilitators and advisory group members, and they reviewed our DEI content. So you'll notice we're trying to make our content more accessible, and we're trying to actually switch to platforms that would make our content more accessible, hopefully in the future. So bear with us while we make these changes. And if you need accessibility, please let us know. And I'll hand it over to Jules.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. So nice to be with you all today. I'm just gonna yank up my slides real quick. Oh my goodness, that's not the right one. There we go. Computer is being nice and slow. Awesome. Great. As we kind of alluded to, today we're going to be focusing mainly on accessibility and how it fits into DEI work. So I'm going to start with this block of text. I promise it will be the only one I throw at you. But I'd like to start with this definition of ableism in all of the training, all the presentations that I do, because I think it's really important to understand how I approach this work, how a lot of people in the disability justice community approach this work. This definition of ableism was co-authored by T.L. Lewis, who is a Black disabled scholar, along with several other disabled academics and activists, and it gets updated about once a year to stay kind of current with the most pressing issues in the disabled community and kind of how that shapes ableism. So what is ableism? A system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression that leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, quote unquote health or wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily produce or reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So I know that was a very heavy academic text, so we're going to break that down a little bit. So this is kind of a diagram that I think explains or demonstrates that definition a little bit more handily. So if we're thinking about people, right? All of us hold multiple identities. Nobody is just white or just queer or just disabled. We are all at the intersection of lots of different identities, and some of those identities hold privilege, and some of those identities are marginalized. So if we think about a game of soccer, right? Let's say that the goal that humans are collectively shooting for is the goal on the right. If you are white, cisgender, straight, non-disabled, wealthy, educated, straight-sized, housed, you hold any of these other privileged identities, you are automatically kind of living closer to the goal with fewer barriers in your way to shoot that ball into the goalpost, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have any challenges, but it means that the identities that you hold are not the things that are making your life more difficult. Contrastingly, if you are a person of color, if you're trans, queer, disabled, poor, less educated, fat, unhoused, any of these other marginalized identities, you are automatically shooting from further down the field, and you have more barriers in your way, often in the form of privileged people who are denying you access to your rights. And so when we think about ableism, we're thinking about all the ways that people differ from kind of these core privileged identities, and the ways that the layering and intersection of those different marginalized identities can keep people from accessing resources and from being able to survive and thrive out in the world. So when we think about how this shows up in our workplaces, both for employees and for consumers, customers, however you refer to the people who use your business, people who experience ableism have a lot of challenges to be fully included. And when we're talking about ableism, obviously, as that definition stated, you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism, but disability is the main kind of identity that we're focusing on here today, because disabled people have significant challenges in accessing employment and in accessing their communities at large. And again, if you are disabled and hold other marginalized identities on top of that, for example, if you're a trans disabled person, if you're a disabled person of color, then those barriers just stack up like Legos. So what are some of these barriers to inclusion for disabled people? One thing that we often don't consider is SSI asset limits. SSI stands for Social Security income. There's also Social Security disability income. These are different government programs that supplement the income of disabled people and older adults who are unable to work or are limited in how much work they can do. It also controls how they're able to get federally funded and state funded health insurance and other benefits. If you are on SSI, there is a certain amount of money that you're allowed to make per month, and there's a certain amount of money that you're allowed to have in your assets. It varies by state, but typically it's around $2,000 in assets that you can have at any time. That includes things like property, cars, so not just liquid assets, but any of that other stuff as well, right? So this means that if you are on SSI and you have more than $2,000 in assets, or you make over a certain amount doing part-time work, then you are thrown off your benefits, you lose insurance, you lose access to all of those other things. And so basically what this means is that there are over 8 million Americans who are systemically barred from earning a living wage, owning a business, doing a lot of the other things that allow people to participate in kind of the business economy. And that is both on the supplier side for disabled people who want to work more and who want to start businesses, but it's also on the consumer side because SSI gives you between $700 and $800 a month, which is obviously not a living wage, and makes it very, very difficult to afford basic things, much less engage with businesses that might sell more elective goods and services. Another thing to consider is lack of outreach. A lot of people don't really think about disabled people as a population that's out there, and there's a reason for that, right? Up until pretty recently, and by pretty recently, I mean the 90s, the default setting for disabled people was in institutions, locked away from society. There are still thousands of people in the United States who are disabled, who live in institutions, who are not able to live in their communities because they are not able to get the support that they need medically and for vocational assistance and things like that within their community, so they're forced to live in institutions. But much more than was the case 30, 40, 50 years ago, there are disabled people out in our communities living in the world. We are among you. But often organizations don't think about making their outreach accessible to disabled people because they don't think of us as a viable population of potential employees or consumers. And so we're not targeted in outreach. And we are already at a deficit because of those years of systemic discrimination and exclusion. And so there's a lot that can be done to work with organizations that are already working directly with disabled people to connect with your disabled communities in both your search for employees and consumers. Another thing to consider is inaccessible systems. Just from a logistic perspective, schools, banking, voting, lots of kinds of jobs are logistically inaccessible to people with various disabilities. Employers don't know how to accommodate their employees with disabilities a lot of the time, which is something that we're going to talk about later in this presentation. There is a legal requirement to give people quote unquote reasonable accommodations, but also embedded within that law is this statement that if an accommodation is quote unquote too burdensome to an employee or to a employer, excuse me, or a service provider, they don't have to provide that accommodation. And the only way to fight back against not receiving an accommodation that you need is to go through the legal system, which takes a lot of money, a lot of time, and really does not result in justice for many people who could work or could participate in all kinds of different things out in society if they were given reasonable accommodations. And then the last thing, which I think is the biggest one that we have a lot of agency over as employers, as co-workers, as advocates in the community, is just general inflexibility. Inflexibility is the enemy of accessibility. If we are rigid about where, how, when people can work or participate in different things, we are always going to be leaving some people out because we're not providing various options for people with different needs to participate. And even among disabled people who are able to kind of be in those environments while not necessarily getting all of their access needs met, it leads to a high amount of burnout among disabled people because we're always fighting for our basic needs to be met. We're always having to explain ourselves and our conditions to people. We're always having to show people how to accommodate us and how to meet our access needs. And so that is if that flexibility were more built into the organizational culture, that wouldn't be something that we have to fight against as hard. It's important to consider that about 26% of Americans have a disability, and I put an asterisk next to this number because that data is very likely super underreported because of the way that the Census Bureau asks about disability. For legal purposes, a disability is any condition that substantially impacts somebody's ability to perform activities of daily living, right? So that means things like getting out of bed, talking, using the bathroom, feeding yourself, a wide range of the things that we all do every day. And so there's a lot of things that are disabilities and that can be kind of looked at through this disability justice lens that a lot of times we don't think about as disabilities. For example, eating disorders significantly impact people's ability to feed themselves, to care for themselves, and to be mentally healthy. And a lot of times we don't think of eating disorders as being part of that, being under that disability umbrella, but they absolutely are. And so when we say 26% of Americans, or about 1 in 4 Americans have a disability, that is likely an underreported number. And I say that just to show that, again, disabled people are everywhere. Even if they don't necessarily identify as disabled, they still benefit from having their access needs met and from looking at things through a disability inclusion lens. So how do we eliminate all of these barriers? When I use the word accessibility, and when we're talking about building accessibility, this is the definition that that I personally use, that my consulting organization uses. Excuse me. It's one that we've like tweaked over time and will probably tweak again. But the definition that we use is that accessibility is a commitment to ensuring that everyone can fully and independently use services, navigate spaces, and not just participate, but lead. So let's break that down a little bit. A commitment. A commitment means it's not just a one-time thing. You're not providing an ASL interpreter for one event and saying, woohoo, we did it, we're accessible. It means you have to think about it all of the time. It has to be baked into your planning process for everything that you do. Everyone. Everyone means everyone. In endeavoring to meet access needs, we can't just think about one type of disability or one type of access need. We have to think about a very wide array of access needs, and also recognize that even 2 people who might have the same diagnosis on paper can have radically different access needs. And so when we say everyone, we really have to mean everyone. Fully and independently. So that means that we're not just giving disabled people the kind of light or like Kroger brand version of what we offer as an organization. We are really trying to make sure that everything that we're doing is as accessible as possible so that everyone with all kinds of disabilities can enjoy the full extent of what we're offering. And independently doesn't necessarily mean by yourself. It really means with the amount of support that you feel comfortable with. So for example, there are some things that I'm always going to need support to do, but I want to be able to choose when and how much support I get when I'm engaging with the offerings for a particular organization. I don't want to be forced to use more support or rely on other people in ways that I might not want to. A good example of this is voting. So for blind people who have, or people with like print disabilities, let's say the accessible voting machine at your polling location is not working, which is more likely than you would think. You are allowed to bring someone into the voting booth with you to help you cast your vote. And that technically makes the process of voting accessible. It means you can do it, but it also takes away that person's choice in how much support they're receiving to cast their vote. Voting is supposed to be private. It's supposed to be something that only you can see, only you know who you vote for. And when we don't have appropriate access options in place, we take away that right from people with certain disabilities. And then using services, navigating spaces, that just means engaging with all of the things. A lot of times when we think about accessibility, we are only thinking about the physical space and like, you know, making sure we have a ramp where there's stairs and things like that. But it also encapsulates every aspect of how people interface with your organization, from outreach to communicating with members of your team, to, yes, navigating physical spaces, navigating digital spaces. So we need to be really holistic in how we're thinking about accessibility. And then not just participating, but leading. This is a big one. The example that I always use is if you have a theater where the audience is accessible for a wheelchair user, for example, but the stage is not accessible for a wheelchair user, then that space is not fully accessible because you have only given disabled people the right to be spectators rather than leaders in that space, people who get to perform or present or whatever in that space. And so we can't just kind of stop accessibility at the spectator level. We need to really integrate it everywhere as much as we can. So I'm gonna go through these real quick. There are a few different ways that we can address these barriers. One avenue is through policy advocacy. So anyone who's doing policy work, some of the things that we might advocate for are raising those SSI asset limits. So, you know, not limiting the amount of money that people receiving benefits can have at any one time, and not endangering their benefits or insurance if they have enough money to be like stable or even, God forbid, upwardly mobile. Updating accessible design standards. The last real round of accessible design standards was revised in 2010. And technology and our knowledge about how to accommodate different disabilities has changed a lot since then. And so there's a lot we can do to bring those standards more up to date with the modern world. Mandatory funding for technical assistance. A lot of businesses and a lot of organizations want to be accessible, but they don't know how, and they don't have necessarily all of the money up front to be able to expedite the process of making things accessible. So having some sort of technical assistance arm of something at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, to be able to meet up with businesses, provide that accessibility consulting, I think is something that would be great to strive for. And then also expanding tax credits for access projects. A lot of people don't know that if you're a small business, 100 employees or less, you are eligible for 3 different tax credits. 2 of them have to do with making your space more accessible to disabled employees and consumers. And the other one has to do with hiring and retaining disabled employees. So I can send along more information about those, or we can talk about them in the Q&A portion as well. What's probably going to be a lot more of us here, speed, is our organizational change methods. Things you can do. Audit for access issues. A lot of us don't know what we don't know. Accessibility is a very complex and multifaceted field. So talking to somebody who does this for a living, like me, can be really helpful in identifying what your organization actually needs to change. Including disability in your DEI efforts. Disability is diversity. Disability intersects with every other identity. Black, brown, and indigenous, LGBTQ+, and other marginalized groups experience disability issues differently, like we talked about earlier, right? That layering effect. And so if you're not including disability in your DEI work, you're not really doing DEI work because you're leaving a ton of people out of the picture. Creating an implementation plan. A lot of us panic when we hear like accessibility because we're like, oh God, I have to change everything about what I'm doing right now. But that's really not realistic for a lot of organizations. And so creating an implementation plan, which again, a consultant can help you with, can help you kind of prioritize and phase the different changes that your organization needs to make to become more accessible. And then lastly, building your accessibility community, seek out information about disability justice and accessibility. I have a reading list that I can share to be sent out to y'all of some different books and articles and stuff to kind of get you started into your deep dive on this path. But try to build community with disabled professionals in your industry, on social media, on LinkedIn, whatever, because we can offer a perspective on the work that you're doing that's obviously disability informed that you might not be getting otherwise. So I've said a lot of things, and you may be wondering, Jules, this is a really nice idea. What does this actually look like in the world? So I wanted to invite Juliana Dodson from the Hannah Grimes Center, who I've worked with for the last few years, but more heavily in this last year, on making some of their programs and practices more accessible. So I'm gonna stop screen sharing, and Juliana, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Jules. Remind me how many minutes?
Like,
So you have 5 minutes, so we can allow for discussion. Thank you, Juliana.
So Jules attended Radically Rural, our national summit of since the beginning, I think maybe, and they reached out to us through the survey and said, we'd love to do an accessibility audit for you and help increase accessibility in the summit, as well as just helping us to figure out how to increase participation among the disability community. And it was such a delightful process to work with Jules. They came by, they sat down with us, talked about what the process would look like, and then just phase by phase went and looked at the different venues we use, asked us about our processes and our systems, and then came up with a really nice, really easy to follow document that just described what their recommendations are, and then additionally an accessibility guide for the summit that was sort of like a blocked graph for each venue so that folks could look at that ahead of time and determine which venue they would reasonably want to access. And so, you know, there was a lot that came up during that time that we had not considered. I had written down to use that analogy about the stage versus the audience because that really stuck with us, and it became a lens that we used to look at all of our programming through. Additionally, on the accessibility sheet, it also described which venues were suitable for larger bodies, which was not something that we had really considered before. They asked us questions about, you know, how are you working in breaks so people can take their medication or, you know, get the food that they need or things like that. And it was just really a wonderful way to start to consider things that we had not considered previously. Ironically, it also taught me as we went about how to advocate for my own needs in other venues, because I had never really considered myself in that category. But as I've been in other situations, I've been able to like be really clear and say, hey, it would be great if we could know when there was a break, you know, today, or different things like that. And so it was a great individual learning process and a great organizational process. We also baked this work into our checklists and processes and procedures to make sure it's not just that one-time thing. Last year, because now that we have this accessibility sheet, we can kind of update it every year based on our venues, which was a fantastic tool to come away with. But last year, Jules kind of took it a step further and said, hey, can I set up a sensory room for you at Radically Rural? So we had this sensory room where folks could escape to, you know, if the kind of the sensory overload got to a certain point, they could, you know, color, just be quiet, you know, whatever they needed to do. And that was a really beautiful resource to have. So that was on the Radically Rural side. And then we engaged neighborhood access as well on our local programming side, and we were able to learn a lot through that process as well. Some examples include, Neighborhood Access did a digital and physical audit. Through that, so there's a lot that we learned that might be more well known about, oh, you really need, a paddle on this door, to an automatic paddle, or you really need this. There was a lot that we learned about the physical space, but additionally, as a part of the training, we learned a lot about neurodiversity, which helped us to make our programs more accessible. So for example, one of our signature programs is our 8-week business lab kind of accelerator course. And in the past, we had only allowed participants to present their final pitches live and in person. And that actually discouraged a lot of folks from participating in our programs. And so this past business lab, we actually opened it up for other formats to be able to do it in as well, like a pre-recorded video. And that has opened accessibility for us. We also changed our intake form, where we changed a little bit about how we ask people to identify themselves, giving a broader range of choices that feels more authentic, and then added a question that allowed us to align, that gave us permission to align their answers with the needs of our funders and so forth. So I will stop there, but we'll just say overall, we really gained a lot as an organization and as individuals. And thank you so much, Jules, for all of your great work with us over the years.
Thank you both. Thank you for sharing this experience with us. And right now we're going to do our breakout sessions. So we're going to ask you a question. We'd like you to think about it, write down your own ideas while we set up the breakout rooms. And then in groups of 3 or 4, we're going to discuss, please introduce yourself, and then discuss the question together. We'll put the question in chat so you have access to it, and then we'll come back as a whole group. So our question for the day is, how does ableism show up in your workplace? How can we dismantle our preconceived ideas about disabled people to better meet the needs of disabled employees and customers? And I just learned that the use of people with disabilities and disabled people is mixing both is desirable, because that's how the community refers to themselves, right, Jules?
Yes, for a long time, there was a push among some people in the disabled community to only use person first language, just saying person with a disability. But as the disability justice movement has continued on, a lot of us prefer to identify just as a disabled person, because we don't think that using that language robs us of our personhood. But certainly people still use both identity first and person first language. So either are valid. And if you are in a like one-on-one setting, or, talking with a specific person, it's always good to check in on what they prefer for themselves. But in a general sense, using both is acceptable for the community.
Okay, so I'm going to create breakout rooms, and please feel free to go. You have time to think about this ahead of time, and then you can move to the breakout rooms. AG, Associated Grocers, I know you're in a group. If you would prefer to do this offline, you can as well. You can discuss amongst yourselves the questions right there. How does ableism show up in your workplace? How can we dismantle our preconceived ideas about disabled people to better meet needs of the disabled employees and customers? Please join the breakout rooms. And